Hey guys, this is Neil again from the Overclocker magazine. Not a review, it's not anything. It's actually, as per title, just my journey in overclocking, learning a new, better way of overclocking. Just to give you some background in how I actually ended up here. Last week, I got like some products that I'm presently in the middle of doing the reviews for. And obviously, one of them is a motherboard. Actually, a motherboard in question is a Z590I Aorus Ultra, right? Mini ITX boards. I generally I've just found myself liking mini ITX boards for some reason, and yeah, I'm a huge fan. But anyway, it's a situation where I was tuning the memory, doing all sorts of stuff, and then it came time to start tuning the CPU, right? And there's a curious feature on the Gigabyte motherboards, the Z590 motherboards. I think it was there from Z490, maybe even before, but I'm definitely sure about it on Z590. You can basically, in the tweakers, in the tweak menu, it's like right at the top option, there's CPU upgrade. So it has two profiles. Obviously, there's default, which is that feature is not active at all, and then I think it has advanced and gamer. So the gamer profile essentially gives you one extra bin on top of your all-core turbo frequencies. So for an 11900K, so that would be 4.9 gigahertz, because I think the all-core turbo frequency is 4.8 gigahertz. I could be wrong about that, could be 4.7, but I think it's 4.8. And then if you choose the advanced option instead of the gamer one, you get 3 bins more. So going from 4.8, adding 3 bins more would take you to 5.1 gigahertz, right? I hadn't used this feature before. I largely just ignored it, which ties into just how I used to do overclocking, or at least approach CPU overclocking. So I started overclocking a while ago, like years, well over 10 years. It's probably closer to 20 years than it is 10 years. I've been overclocking. And for the longest time, all we ever had to do was worry about or concern ourselves rather with a single multiplier. That's all you dealt with. The CPU is either at 4 gigahertz, 4.55, whatever it may be, that's all you're dealing with. And we did this for the longest time and it still worked. Especially for competitive overclocking, you definitely want to still do that sort of thing. But for everyday overclocking, which is where I've come to find myself more often these days, if only because LN2 locally, as some of you may know, is hideously expensive and just a chore to get a hold of. But in just dealing with more regular overclocking, I've come to realize, even for my own machine, that old method of overclocking of just using one fixed multiplier isn't working anymore. It's probably the most counterproductive way of overclocking. Now that I'm here, I'm actually realizing that now, because for the longest time, as enthusiasts, we've always said to Intel, to any other AMD, whoever, that we always want more overclocking features and knobs to tune that will allow us to extract the best performance from the system. And when those options came about, I largely ignored them because, hey man, I'm old school. You just said one multiplier and call it a day. That's literally how we did things. But as we got more cores on the CPUs and so forth, it started just making sense to have a situation where you can exploit all core turbo frequencies or overclock frequencies, and as well as getting the most out of the single best performing core within the package, because not all cores are equal. And the more you have, the more unequal they're likely to be. So if there is such a mechanism that allows you to extract the best single thread or single core performance in terms of frequency, and also get the most that you can in terms of the all core frequency, then you should be able to do that. You should definitely be able to do that. So now I go back to the Gigabyte CPU upgrade options that I was telling you about earlier. So what happens is that with these two options, I tried the first one, the gamer one, and it was just 100 megahertz on the all core frequency. And then I went back and I tried the advanced mode, which is 3 bins more, and the performance was awesome. I mean, CPU Z gives you over like 7,100 in the CPU Z bench, and yeah, that's a pretty great score. It's a lot higher than what you would get at default as well. I was happy with that. And in my thinking, oh, okay, so I'm going to get 3 bins more, but is that going to interfere with the ABT, the Intel, what is it? Advanced Boost Technology or something like that. Essentially, what allows you to get 5.3 gigahertz out of an 11900K. So I was thinking, I'm going to be able to get that. The CPU option, that's all it does. It just gives you 3 bins more, and I still get to keep the 5.3 gigahertz single core clock. I was like, this is awesome. It's probably the first time where an auto overclocking feature is actually working exactly as I expected to, in a way that's beneficial without pumping a lot of juice through your CPU and just giving you this mediocre OC, which is generally what used to happen before. So with this motherboard, that wasn't what was happening, but only to find out that I was actually not getting my 5.3 gigahertz single core peak performance or peak frequency anymore. I was just getting 5.1 gigahertz and that was it. So I had to start figuring out now, how do I get the most out of this? Because now that I've experienced a CPU that can do 5.1 gigahertz on all cores, I would generally still want to be able to make use of my 5.3 gigahertz as well. I'm not willing to let go of 200 megahertz off the top of the 2 best performing cores because I've gotten everything to 5.1 gigahertz. And especially because, let's face it, a lot of the tasks that I need to do with my computer or any other sort of testing or gaming and so forth, they are largely single threaded. And that got me thinking, how do I myself get that same 5.1 gigahertz on all cores, but keep the 5.3 as well? So I tried what I usually do on any other motherboard, and in fact I was only able to pull this off and finally understand how thermal velocity boost works by watching the scatter bench video by PJ. You should watch that video. I'll link it in the description below. He gives you a really great rundown on how to overclock the 11900K step by step, and he does that for both. I think he does it on a gigabyte board and he also did it on a ROG board. So basically you can pick whichever board that you have. You can just watch any of those 2 scatter bench videos, and they actually go into detail explaining TVB and the technical merits behind it and what you are actually trying to achieve here. But just for simplifying things, you'll see that in the footage that all you basically have to do is just set your 2 highest bins for single core frequency. So you basically are going to be setting, if 1 core is active, this is the frequency I want. If 2 cores are active, this is the frequency I need. If 3 cores are active, and so forth, and all the way until all 8 cores are active. And what I did, because I just wanted to keep this simple, I set the first 2 cores in terms of load. So if we have a single core load or a 2 core load, the CPU will operate at 5.3 gigahertz. But if we have an all-core load, then the CPU will operate at 5.1 gigahertz. And setting that just meant I literally had to just key in 53, 53, and then 51 for everything else under a thermal velocity boost. And usually that does the trick. Okay, that does the trick. The only thing that you would have to do in terms of managing in terms of managing voltages is to set your offset voltages. You can either set it in the old school way, just set a legacy general offset, and I would basically set that at that minus 50 millivolts or minus 100 millivolts depending on the motherboard, and yeah, that would be it, and the CPU would take care of everything else. But on this particular motherboard, it actually didn't do that. So what would happen is I would set 53, 53, then 51 all the way through, and then I would find myself having to now deal with a CPU that would start out at 5.1 gigahertz all core, but then slowly go all the way down to like 4.9 gigahertz and perhaps even lower. And I was wondering, what is happening here? Why is this motherboard behaving in this peculiar way? I even set 5.2 gigahertz, right, as the lowest bin for all core loads, and the same thing would happen. So I was just getting so frustrated with it, only to find out that, hey, you need to set like your current limit. Even though you have everything disabled or set to max, you actually need to set that to 256 amps, essentially allow the CPU to draw as much. And instantly when I did that, my 5.1 was operating as I wanted to, so I was getting max 5.3 and 5.1, as you can see on the screen right now. And yeah, so now after so many months and so many, or at least a couple of years since we've had these various tuning abilities, I finally understand them and have come to embrace them. And I realize now that this is literally the best way to overclock for this generation, and I can imagine for 12th gen, 13 going forward, be it on AMD or Intel as well. This old school method of overclocking that I used to use, it limits you to the worst performing core. Essentially, you're going to get the worst possible overclock imaginable or possible because you are limited by the worst performing core. So you can't necessarily change that when it comes to all core overclocking, but what you can do is, on the flip side, make sure that you are making use of the best performing core as well. And that's the power of these knobs, these tuning knobs that Intel has added over the years through to the CPUs. I wasn't able to talk about them in depth because not only was I not overclocking that way, thermal velocity boost was kind of complicated for me. It seems so obvious now, but it was complicated for me. And another thing that forced me into this new appreciation in this position was that if you're going to make use of the thermoelectric coolers, the Intel cryo cooling technology, you're going to need to exploit thermal velocity boost, because that technology works for single-threaded workloads where one core is active, or maybe two in some instances, but it's mostly for single core. And to get the most out of that, you're going to have to use thermal velocity boost. And you're going to need to understand how that works in conjunction with the cryo cooler to get the most that you can from the entire system. So all of these things came together at the same time, forcing me into this newfound appreciation of overclocking on the 11th gen CPUs and going forward. And it was this motherboard that actually, in an odd way, forced me to finally make that jump. And I'm really grateful for that. I think the feature to just give you 3 pins more out the box is fantastic. If they can perhaps make that work in conjunction with the 5.3 gigahertz that you would normally get for your lightly threaded workloads, I think this would be the easiest way to overclock, especially if you have a substandard CPU like the one I had. I was still able to get 300 megahertz higher all core frequency boost with just a click of a button. So that's pretty awesome. But yeah, I just wanted to share this with you, something that is meaningful for me, that finally I've embraced a better, newer way of overclocking. And I'm actually interested to see how far I can stretch thermal velocity boost with sub-zero temperatures. Obviously with the ML360 Sub-Zero, like the Cooler Master unit, but more so with dry ice as well. I will not do any sort of dry ice overclocking on this particular motherboard, but I will use the very good board, Tachyon, to do that sort of exercise and that adventure. Anyway, with that said, guys, yeah, let me know what you think. What is your experience with overclocking and that sort of thing? And I'll probably see you when I do the Aorus DDR4 4400 memory review. If not that, it will be another DRAM review. I'm not sure which one will come first. I'll let you know about that at a later point. Until next time, you guys take care of yourselves and stay blessed, and I'll see you on the flip side.